Join us on a journey where we unravel the latest trends, tackle your burning questions, and explore innovative strategies that are shaping the future of compensation, all with a cup of coffee in hand. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of Comp and Coffee. I am Ruth Thomas, your host, and today we are returning to a topic that we have discussed a few times before, the EU Pay Transparency Directive. And it's very timely because as we're recording this, the transposition date, the June the 7th, 2026 date, has just passed. And so that was the date that EU member states were due to have transposed the EU Pay Transparency Directive into their local laws. Some countries met the deadline. Most did not. We will hear more about that in a minute. And today we're going to be reflecting on kind of where we ended up, what's the latest on legislation as that deadline has passed, what organisations who have been preparing have been getting right so far, some of the challenges and risks that as an employer you should be thinking about as we consider this body of legislation. And then maybe we'll spend a little bit of time talking about maybe what happens beyond compliance. And then I will be asking each of our guests to share some tips with you before we close out the podcast. So I have three wonderful guests joining me today. We have Vicky Peakman, Tom Hayes, and David Lorimer. I'm going to let them introduce themselves and tell you all about their involvement in the EU Pay Transparency Directive. So Tom, let's start with you first. Would you like to introduce yourself to the audience?
Hello, audience. I'm Tom Hayes. I co-lead our Pay Transparency Directive practice at Lewis Silkin. I've been doing gender pay gap reporting in the UK for getting on for about 10 years now as well. That was my route into the PTD.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom. David, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, delighted to be here and thanks for having us. I am David Lorimer. I co-lead Lewis Silkin's Pay Transparency practice. Think of me as the Morecambe to Tom's Wise, I guess. And we've been working through lots of thorny issues for clients for what feels like an eternity. And it is starting to feel a bit like pay transparency is my entire personality, but there we go.
And welcome. You are both newcomers to the Comp and Coffee podcast. So one of the questions we always ask are you a coffee or a tea drinker? Tom, what about you?
Iced coffee for me, thanks.
Iced coffee. And David?
Coffee till I die.
Coffee till you die, right. Okay, thank you very much. Vicky, welcome back to the podcast. Obviously, you've been here a few times before. Do you want to remind the audience who you are?
Yeah, it's great to be back and with such a esteemed group of people. So I am Vicky Peakman. I used to work with Ruth at PayScale, but now I run Fair Pay Partners, which we focus on pay transparency, pay equity, fair pay, anything to do with that. And basically at the moment, it's almost entirely the EU Pay Transparency Directive.
Okay, thank you. Well, welcome all three of you. Let's start with the legislative landscape as we reach that key deadline. Normally, I would do my legal rider here. I am not a lawyer. Well, I am definitely not a lawyer, but I have two lawyers on the call with me today. But we do always kind of advise you that we are not here to give legal advice. It's really kind of guidance, and you should always seek guidance from your internal counsel. But we are helped by having two lawyers on the call today. So, as I said, the transposition deadline passed on June the 7th, and we ended up with quite a complex picture in terms of the number of member states that have either met the deadline, partially met the deadline, have draft legislation in place. Maybe that's the starting point. I'm going to ask David, I think. Let's start with you. Could you just give us like a quick status without going through all 28 member states of where we ended up on that transposition deadline?
So that would be a dull, and it would also be a test of my geographic knowledge, wouldn't it? Yes, so I think it's fair to say the directive has not been completely transposed in every member state. So we do have some countries who get an A+ for doing it on time, albeit slightly rushed job. Those are Italy, Slovakia, Lithuania, and the latecomer Malta that transposed over the weekend. So those are the ones that have implemented. There's some delays in some of those countries in terms of when things come live, but they've done their work. The rest of the member states have not. And as you say, Ruth, there's a kind of variance in terms of some have draft legislation, some haven't even reached that stage yet. And frankly, then there's Sweden at the back of the pack that did all of its work, got a nice draft ready quite early, and then decided that they were so frustrated by the whole thing that they were throwing their toys out of the pram and have said they're not going to implement at all until the whole thing is renegotiated. And that's the picture on transposition. It's kind of well, we're still ongoing. I suppose one thing to say is, if you're a fan of the markets on this stuff, then the next ones we think to watch out for are Latvia, Romania, and Bulgaria.
And Tom, why have all these countries not met the deadline? Big question, I know, but can you give the audience some kind of idea about why we didn't get to 28 countries on June the 7th?
Well, I mean, it's not like these countries were surprised with the PTD overnight. I mean, it was finalised 3 years ago, 2023. There was plenty of time for each country to, take steps to try and implement it or think about how they might want to implement it. I think so many countries kicked the can down the road and thought, well, this is a big problem. We'll get to it eventually. Other things took priority, I suppose. And then when countries started looking at it closer to the deadline, say within the past year or so, I think many have realized actually this is really big. It's going to change loads of things. We should have been thinking about this in more detail and more promptly. And so, I think I think a lot of countries are maybe trying to do it right or do it as best as they can rather than just try and get something over the line.
And there were obviously some countries last week, late entrants, who managed to get legislation across the line. Whilst that seems great news, it's not necessarily great news for the employers in that country, is it? Because they now have a very short time frame in which to sort of start to really focus on compliance. Any views on that from you, Vicky?
Yeah, so it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because obviously all the employers also knew 3 years ago that this was supposed to be coming, and I don't know if you, but some of us have been mentioning it a few times in advance. But my concern actually is not for that's big companies, right? Big companies with HR, they knew about it because we all talked about it. But this actually affects every company who've got more than one person. And so there will be loads of companies who have never, ever heard about it because it's not been in the press and it's not been out, and they're not, they don't have HR, they don't know. And so actually, I do think it's really, really hard for those companies. And for Malta, for example, I mean, I think Lithuania and Slovakia did it sort of the best when they said, well, okay, here it is, but there's going to be an implementation period for the harder bits to comply with. And so, whereas, Malta comes in on Friday and says on Monday, you've got to be compliant with all this. And I think for all those smaller companies in Malta, I think it's an issue. Yeah.
And Malta has the strictest
Yeah.
time limit for right to information, 8
That's
days,
right?
right?
8 days. Crazy, right? Yeah. So
Explain that to me then. So right to information is one of the requirements of the Pay Transparency Directive. Do one of you, Tom, do you want to explain what that is? And then we can understand the context of the 8 days.
Yeah, so the PTD says that member states have to implement a right to information. So every employee gets the right to ask for the average pay of men and women of those in the same category as them. So those doing work of equal value. The PTD says there should be that right should be complied with within 2 months or as soon as, reasonably practicable. For Malta to have said 8 days really accelerates that timeline. And the reality is that there's a lot of work involved in putting together the data to be able to comply. So I think in Malta, it means in practice, employees are going to have to be ready to go at any time, have everything ready. So as soon as someone makes that request, they're not starting to put things together. They've just got it all and they can just do it. There is also the other thing in Malta as well. If you delay past 45 days, there's criminal sanctions.
So does that mean because they passed their legislation, they transposed their legislation on the 7th or by the 7th of June, that means now an employee could ask and an employer in Malta has 8 days in which to reply?
Exactly, right now.
Gosh. That's fun.
And I think eventually this will become more automated. People,
yes.
companies will know what they're doing. There'll be all their systems will be up and around, payroll will have a report, whatever it is. That eventually 8 days is probably going to be quite simple for most people. Obviously, there are some times when you get a data and you want to kind of check it or whatever, but like it feels like a really short day. But eventually, a couple of years down the line, I think, 8 days maybe isn't too much. But now, when they haven't, like that's, yeah.
I think
And the
there's
other
still
complicating factor there is, unlike for our US audience that might be listening, EEOC reporting requirements, or you mentioned, Tom, earlier, the UK gender pay gap reporting requirements. We're talking about just pay, as in base pay. The requirements of the EPTD define pay as total rewards. Do one of you want to kind of just explain that a bit more?
Yeah, I mean, the Pay Transparency Directive takes the broadest possible construction of pay, and that has its roots in equal pay. How equal pay is litigated in practice. So it's everything under the sun. It's not just base pay, it's allowances, it's bonuses, it's commission, potentially equity, very thorny issue, and it's benefits in kind as well. So this kind of data lives in our experience in many different systems and none. It's quite hard to get together. And then the other distinction for our US listeners is the groups that you're comparing are much broader in practice too. So when the EU talks about work of equal value, it's not just talking about people on the same job codes. It's talking about people who you wouldn't normally think of as comparators. You're looking really broadly at conceptual things like skills, effort, responsibility, working conditions. So there's two really big distinctions, both of which make spinning up compliance in a hurry quite challenging.
Right. Yeah. And I guess one of the other myths that sometimes floats around, and it's a question I get asked a lot whenever we do webinars on this, is there a threshold in terms of the size of the employer that these requirements apply to? Tom, do you want to kind of just clarify that for us?
not in terms of the right to information. So that applies to every employer. 2 employees or more, I suppose. The one employee companies probably aren't making requests of themselves. But as Vicky said, for small employers, it presents a real problem, and they will all get caught by it. Likely won't have, maybe not even HR function, and yet there will be publicity and awareness, or maybe there is right now, of the PTD and these new rights. So you've got probably lots of small employers facing requests that they maybe don't know what to deal with.
So the employer thresholds that we hear about actually apply to the pay gap reporting requirements, which are, of course, another part of the EU PTD that we have talked about before. So obviously we got to the deadline. Only a small number of member states had achieved the goal set, as you said, Tom, 3 years ago. You can keep up to date with which countries are, continuing to pass the pay scale. We have a legislation page that we keep up to date. I think you've got one too, Lewis. And so haven't you? Do you have a legislation page where you keep everybody up to date?
We do. We've got an implementation tracker with lots of fun colors to show who's feeling on the subject and who's implemented and what the mess of implementation looks like.
And then you can follow any of the guests on today's episode on LinkedIn, where I know they have actively been keeping people up to date with the legislation as it happens. So let's move on a bit. Think about, as you said, 3 years organisations have known the terms of the EU Pay Transparency Directive. They've known what's coming. So those that have been preparing, what have they got right so far? Vicky, from a kind of like advising organisations, what are you seeing that organisations have got right so far?
I think the ones that are like as ready as they could be by now, and the ones that maybe thought about it in a slightly wider way than just a compliance problem, they got they understand where their data is, where it is, how to bring it together, what it's saying, and they've also thought really hard about communication, particularly like how do we talk to the different groups that we're going to talk to? How do we get each managers to be able to talk about it with it? How do we talk to employees? Sorry. One of the parts of the directive is that you have to provide a lot more information to employees than you used to have to. So how have you done that kind of communication? How have you done the preparation? And then also there's workers' representatives. There's also the executives that you've got to deal with because of your pay gap reporting. So it's how are you doing that from a communication point of view and actually thinking about it as a part of your reward strategy rather than thinking about it as a compliance issue.
And David, from your perspective, like you've been working with organizations over this period, what are you seeing that they have done well?
Yeah, I would say a couple of things, and they perhaps echo or overlap with what Vicky said, unsurprisingly, but those that have wrestled with what they do at the moment and identified the gaps or identified the ways in which perhaps that doesn't quite meet the demands of the directive. And so to make that a bit more tangible, have you got a system of classification that works for value? Have you got anything built into your existing architecture that is intentionally measuring value and which drives pay at your organization? Because if so, let's think critically about whether that needs to be tweaked and upgraded but can fit rather than scorched earth policy of starting again. And then I think to Vicky's point on comms, actually really early engagement, recognizing this is a totally cross-functional piece to just get the key stakeholders on board. So I think Vicky's talking about your audiences for Go Live, your employees, your HR leaders, your employee reps. Absolutely, that's right. But that early engagement to bring people along in terms of local HR and payroll practitioners, in terms of legal colleagues, in terms of the board, just so that they can be clear on what their role is in getting that data together and testing it and feeling comfortable with the direction of travel. That's been a really important early step that organizations who've gone well have taken.
Yeah, it's a really important point, David, because I think I've said this a few times, is this is not just a problem for compensation or HR. I know they're the traditional audience of this podcast, but this is a compliance and risk issue as well as being a employee engagement issue. And so, this should be a collaborative process in terms of ensuring compliance with this body of legislation. I always say if we were, bringing in a new set of like financial regulatory laws that were of the same scale of this, this would not be one department doing this. It would be like a cross-functional effort within an organization. And it definitely needs to be, I think, for, you to succeed across the board, because there are data issues. Data quality is obviously one of the key issues. There are system issues in terms of the right to information request. Are you going to be able to reply to employees through some kind of HR system that you have? That you have job architecture, you have communications and education for managers as well. So it is really definitely a cross-functional approach. And anything else, Tom, from your perspective that you've seen good practice from employers in terms of getting ready for the PTD?
I think there's been a lot of focus on the right to information and less focus on looking at gaps and trying to see what gaps you are. So I think those who are top of the class are the ones who have been looking at your gaps, seeing where there are issues, and then taking steps to try and, if not reduce them, at least ensure you know why there are differences in pay, at least to be able to explain them.
Yeah. And there's one way you can get ahead of the game there, obviously, because the 5% threshold, which is the reporting pay gap reporting requirement, you really want to make sure that you fall below that so that you don't get into this joint pay assessment, which is kind of where you would have to go to, which could be very complex, particularly if you're in a country that has employee representatives. That's not going to be an easy process. So, making sure you've done that work and done as much as you can to make sure that you are ensuring those pay gaps come beneath that 5% pay gap. Vicky, have you been doing pay gap analysis with organisations? How have they been finding that if this was the first time that they were doing this?
Yes, I think there's quite a lot of surprise in actually how big some of the pay gaps are, particularly with small groups, and like some of that's just mathematical like issues, right? And actually, some of it's completely explainable, and so but it is actually I think has been quite a shock. Because there's a lot of companies, like you think about the UK, we've got the gender pay gap reporting, and then the same in Ireland, similar thing. There's some other things like that are in other countries, but they've not actually looked at them in these equal value job groups. And I think that's where it's because often what you do is you're looking at it at a job level, and then you're looking at it at a wider level. You're not necessarily looking at it, and particularly when a lot of companies think that they're doing pay equity analysis while they're doing their annual merit reviews, but what they're doing is comparing at a job level or underneath, a manager's looking at it on their own, people who are working for themselves versus like actually these groups are a lot wider. And so there has been quite a surprise. Now, as I say, a lot of those gaps actually are explainable. I mean, I think obviously we'd all want those gaps to be small because but a lot of it's to do with, skills and opportunity. And so there's often, or like different kind of jobs and what they're paid and different kind of tenure lengths and different kind of experiences, different performances, so there's all sorts of reasons why people are paid differently and they're all justifiable. David can correct me if I'm wrong here, but like, they are, but if, those pay gaps look big to start with, then even if you can explain them, they also can be companies are like, well, how are we going to, we've got to explain this, and it's hard to do
And
so.
I
And
think
then
that
obviously
speaks.
some companies can't explain it, and that's even worse.
Sorry, I thought you'd
No, keep
finished.
going.
Carry on.
So I think maybe some of that speaks to the communications that we've already talked about. Even having the confidence to know that employees need to understand that there's nuance to this and that it's not just a case of, my goodness, big headline gap, that must mean I work for a bad faith employer. That's just not true. But again, if you haven't been laying the foundations around how comp works and how value works, and if you can't explain that in an accessible way, which by the way is no easy feat. I think we're all experienced in this area. We've all spent years immersed in it, and we still find it complex and tricky. But if you can't find a way to make that accessible to employees, then that's the bigger danger.
Yeah. Well, I think part of the problem is, Vicky, you and I have talked about this before, is there's so much historical noise in pay systems. It'd be fine if we were setting up a company today and we were going to start paying everybody today. But for many organizations and also for us as individuals, what our pay is today is very much the history of, our last however many years we've been working. And so there's a lot of that pay history that before we even started talking about pay gaps, that lives in pay systems today, which does make it very hard to explain and get to really understand why pay gaps are existing.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think that's why I talk to companies like it's almost like you can sort of split it into two sort of things. One is like, okay, if we were starting now, right, and we obviously know what we want to do, how do we want to pay? How do we pay, and are we happy with that? If we're happy with that, great, that's how we want to pay in the future. If we're not happy about that, let's just change it a bit now, and then make sure we do pay going forward. So all the candidates that come in, all the merit reviews, everything going forward is actually meeting, so that we can explain that, because we're doing it now like we should. Because obviously the salary history bands, for example, which we know as some of the reasons why there's pay gaps, are coming in now. And so as much as we probably shouldn't have, necessarily thought, we should maybe have thought about things a little bit more earlier, we didn't. And so, but we can from now on. And so that's the point. So from now, this is how we're going to work. Now, the other thing we have to do is think about, how do we take all of the historical kind of complexity and a bit of mess and a bit of noise that we maybe have done, some of the mistakes we've made in the past because we had to hire that person because they were like, we didn't have anyone in and we really needed them and they were asking for more, but we kind of had to do it anyway because that all of that sort of stuff that happened before. What do we do about that to try to make it so that when we're fairer for those as well? So that's the two problems. And I think a lot of companies have been thinking about the mess, how do we kind of explain all that, rather than thinking, okay, there's also the going forward issue.
If you're disciplined, I suppose, about the new normal, so about how you're going to do things from now on, the mess will go over time.
That's right.
Because people
Yep.
leave and they'll take
Yep.
their mess with them. And if you keep doing it cleanly and quite strict about it, then eventually, 5-10 years, there'll be no more mess.
That's right.
Yeah, absolutely. Now let's talk about areas of highest risk from a legal lens. What are the highest risk areas employers should be prioritizing right now? Tom, do you want to kind of start us off there?
Well, I think for those employers in countries where the PTD has gone live already, I think it's got to be getting the right to information right. The sanctions can vary in different places. The time limits are often quite short. I mean, Malta is the extreme example, but they can be relatively short as well. And it is a big job because, as Vicky said, this hasn't all been sorted out yet. It hasn't been operationalized. So I think getting the right to information right and getting your processes in place is, I think, something that should be done.
David, you want to add on there?
Yeah, I think ultimately this is, employers should be in no doubt. This directive is about surfacing pay inequality and making it much easier for employees and worker representatives to challenge that, ultimately in the form of equal pay claims if employers don't grasp the reins and try to, in good faith, to fix it themselves. So that is the end point. Tom is absolutely right that the initial focus should be on compliance with the biggest ticket, day one right, which is right to information. But that and reporting on categories and the reforms in the directive in terms of how you litigate these things, they're all about making it easier. And what we've seen in the past, and Tom's talked about this lots, is that where transparency, where there's clarity or information around pay, how pay is awarded, and what the differences are, equal pay claims always follow. And that's been the history in the UK around kind of unionized council sites and around big supermarket type claims as well. So we can expect that, and that is the big kind of legal sting in the tail. The sanctions under the directive are one thing. I would expect that most labour inspectorates and equality bodies would be reasonably lenient in terms of the day-to-day getting this right for the first couple of years. They're getting their head around this too. And if employers are trying in good faith to comply, then they'll probably be relative leniency. But yeah, really it's all about the end destination, which is those employers who aren't getting it right more holistically can probably expect to have some equal pay liabilities.
Yeah, it's one of the things I've heard is that unless you actually tell employees that they have this, the right to information, that maybe employees won't ask. And I think there was a study done in Germany at one point saying that this was a right for employees in Germany, and only a small percentage of employees actually taken employers up. Do you think that's going to happen here, or do you think it's now been so widely talked about that all employees are going to know that this is their right and will be like talking to their employers about it? Anybody want to go there?
I think employees will use it.
Mhm.
And I think what David mentioned about claims, I think that's going to be inevitable. And I think the UK gives quite a good example of what happens when that information gets out there. So 10, 15 years ago, we had a lot of big equal value, equal pay cases against councils, local authorities, and they were all brought because the information was available. You could get it through freedom of information. The PTD sort of sets up the same situation, the ability to find out information and to know where your comparators are, what jobs you're equal to. It gives employees everything that they need to find out if people are being underpaid, and pay is. It's an emotive topic, and people don't like to, feel like if they're working hard and they're not getting the same as someone else, they'll be angry about that.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely, when we saw the gender pay gap reporting requirements come in the UK, there was a lot of awareness from employees and employees asking questions of their employers. This is even more pertinent because it is an individual employee right to be able to, request that information now, whereas obviously that reporting in the UK was at the company level. So we've talked a lot about the laws and we've talked a lot about compliance, but this is a bigger conversation than that, because you can be 100% compliant, but if you don't start to tackle some of the bigger issues around your compensation philosophy, pay transparency, how you monitor pay decisions on a day-to-day basis, you are going to be in this kind of whack-a-mole situation where you're probably going to be constantly trying to address pay inequities in your business. So let's talk a little bit about that. Vicky, how are you thinking about defensible pay in this new environment with this new body of compliance existing?
Yeah, so I think this is where the sort of communication side of it comes in, because in the end, it's about fairness, right? It's about me as an employee. Do I believe that the company is doing what it says it's doing, and therefore paying me the way that it says it is paying, and they're paying the person next to me in exactly the same way, right? So do I believe that? And you were saying about, like, am I going to ask, employees going to ask, right? I feel that you could, as a company, get to the point where employees aren't asking because you're telling them enough information that actually they don't need to ask the question because it's actually there. I mean, if you are a company who's reporting, then your pay gaps by category are actually going to be out there anyway. There'll be average pay, you might just provide the average pay at the same time so everyone knows it, and then yourself, why you're paid as you are, what the others, so actually that it's about how do you communicate so that they believe it. Now there will be, we know from evidence that actually there are people who are paid fairly who don't believe they're being paid fairly. And that's, those companies have worked so hard to pay fairly and then the employees don't believe it because they're not actually they're not communicating it properly. There are also companies who are probably paying unfairly but are doing so well in the communications. But I do think that's where that comes in, and it's about trust. Do I trust my employer to be paying me fairly so that I don't have to, find the information and then take them to court?
Yeah. David, do you want to add on there?
Yeah, I think there is a trust issue there, and I think ultimately there will be some employees who never trust their employer. But I think it's the right goal to aim for, and absolutely is right. This all boils down to, do you trust your employer to pay you fairly? I think there's also we touched on this briefly, haven't we? There's also the understanding gap, right? So before I think employees can trust that you're paying them fairly, they need to know the terms on which that's done. And that is the trickiness of some of this, because on the one hand, you can be really kind of glib and top level with your messaging, and then maybe you get there. But actually, the directive does require us to go a little more granular than that. And so it's about, in some ways, upskilling employees and employee reps and getting them familiar with and comfortable with the concepts that underpin all of this, the equal value work, the broad definition of pay, all of that stuff. And then once they get their heads around that, once they feel more comfortable with those concepts, exactly to Vicky's point, do they then trust that you're doing it fairly? Folding in all of the various reasons why there might be pay variance. It's not just fair pay, isn't just about having everyone at the same level.
And it's also about maintaining that governance on an ongoing basis. So Tom, like how should employers think about that in terms of ongoing maintenance of pay governance and ensuring that pay gaps don't creep back in?
I think you need to make sure you've got any discretion only in the places where it really should be. Because if you give line managers too much discretion in how they're setting pay, how they're awarding bonuses, if you're not clear with them as to how they should be doing it, then this is how biased decisions, unfairness starts creeping in. So I think you've got to. We talked about discipline before. I think this is an area in which you have to have some discipline about how you're doing things.
Yeah. And just making sure that you're monitoring during hiring, during promotion processes, every time a pay decision is being made within an organization, do you have the guidance in place to make sure that that decision is made in context of kind of all the frameworks that you've put in place, and that you're actively monitoring for that? And then this will all start to, it sounds like a lot, but it will all start to hopefully then work harmoniously. And as you said, Tom, then those pay differences will start to work their way out of the system, hopefully.
Yeah, and I think it is you say it's a lot, and I think it is a lot. The PTD is a massive change for lots of companies. It kicks up a lot of dust. It throws out the old way of doing things in lots of different aspects. But I think eventually there will become a new normal way of doing things. It will take a bit of time to get there, and that might not happen for the next few years. It might be 5-10 years, but eventually there will be a new way of doing things.
I'm trying to remember, did the EU Commission state any timeline that, their objective of equal pay across the EU would be achieved? I don't remember there being any specific timeline, was there?
They certainly observed that the pay gap had gone down from 13% to 11% over the however many decades they've been monitoring this. So the overt was definitely to bring down that pay gap.
Faster rate. Okay, well, thank you for all your insights today. We're gonna do a quick round robin, and I'm going to say from each of you, if you could give an advice to our audience, like what is the one thing and that you would recommend that they do right now? And we haven't conferred on this, so we'll see how this goes. I'm going to let Vicky go first.
Thank you very much. I would say that sort out your communications with your employees. Like, that's the main thing. Make sure you can make them detailed enough so that someone can absolutely understand how you pay.
And do you think keeping them informed of like how you're dealing with the different compliance that you're facing as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think to start with, you're going to be like, this is to do with that, because everyone's going to be hearing about it. But eventually, we're not going to talk about the PTD. We're just going to talk about pay. And so this has to be this is going forward going to be in all of your communications about pay. It's not ever going away. It's not a one and done. This is, going forward. So, and as David was saying about, it's about, we're talking about fairness, but everyone has different sort of views of what fairness is. You could read all of it and go, well, I don't want to be paid like this. And that's your choice, but if you are staying at that company, then you want to be paid the same as everyone else.
Yeah. Tom, what would be your top tip?
I think given that it underpins a couple of big issues, I think make sure you've got your categories right, your equal value categories, because if those are not up to scratch, then your right to information responses won't be up to scratch. And also eventually when we get to it, the reporting by category also won't be, and whatever gaps you're calculating, that they're not going to actually be reflective of any pay differences.
Yeah, so a critical step there. And David, your top tip?
I think this might be stealing off something Tom said a bit earlier, or leaning on it if you like, but it's to that discretion point. We know that bad pay decisions are made where there's lots of discretion given to hiring managers and to people managers. And so make it easy for them to help you comply. And probably that involves two things. So maybe there's a bit of a cheat. So one, for hiring managers, really go to town with them on where they want to go outside of range, and also how they're justifying why their candidate lands in a particular zone in the range. Get that captured. And in the same way, as their people progress, be capturing why particular pay decisions are made and be evidencing it, because that's going to help you.
Yeah, keeping a track of why pay decisions are being made a critical step as well. Well, great. Thank you both, or thank you all three of you for those tips. The great discussion that we've had today. The transposition deadline may have passed this week, but the pay transparency journey is far from over, as is the story of how compliance is going to play out. So many challenges for organizations. You can obviously, as I said earlier, follow any of our esteemed guests today on LinkedIn. They will be continuing to provide advice. And I would just like to say thank you very much to Vicky, Tom, and David for joining us today and sharing their insights. Thank you all very much. And as always, we'd love to hear from you. So if you have anything to say on the topic, you can email us at coffee@payscale.com. Or if you have any questions and suggestions for future episodes, then email us there. Thank you all very much for listening. Thank you very much, guests.
Thank you.
Thank you.